Okay, first of all, from last week, because this is just really an aside, it's not whatever, but I just want to clarify. The Mechlokes played Aristotle Medezach. It's be'etzem the Mechlokes the two ways is a question on method. It's not so much a question on what knowledge is. I think it's important that the get the mushal have to be the Yigel Midrash Shator and Dreishes Bem. Yigel Midrash Shator and Dreishes Bem is basically it's a method. It's a mode. It's a method of exposition on the Torah, and in order to have Torah Shabbat be a Torah Shel Chaim, a living Torah, so we have to have exposition. It has to conform with the times. That's sort of the wrong word, but you get the point I'm trying to say. And the Torah is not conforming to our times, but it's a separate discussion. But that said, we have the Yigdal Midas as telling you how I can be doidish from the Torah certain things. Right? That's a thing. Now, what's considered be'etzem a kavachoyme? Now I know did it really fit all the qualifications to be a kavachoyme? Gezayir shobin now. That's a separate machlokes. The Eisik Shazavuchim. We have the whole. In the Paidik and Isaac Kush's book, we have a whole machlokes there exactly. I mean, it's a lot of prutim mekulim, but that's a mode. It's a method. It's a method of exposition. The lahavdol again. So played in Aristotle, the two ways of approaching a thing. We said that was a method. That's a method. What it constitutes knowledge to that you actually have true knowledge. That's a separate discussion of epistemology with Michal Nishnegaya. Now let's go with the main point. Right. So last week we spoke about Jung. And we say Jung's shitta wasn't necessarily particularly Hasidism, this was in general his psychological understanding of the world at large as such. And we tried to say how he'd deal with Hasidus, and we critiqued it. Now, the critique that we had on Jung was not a critique because Jung says that I'm going to believe certain concept of comparative religion. I find archetypes that all religions share. Jung is wrong, because I can say that every religion is the same, every religion is different. That's not a critique. Not only that, Jung would respond and say just opposite. From the fact that every religion has the same archetype, same structure, same concept, that shows that my way is correct. I found a universal, true structure of how the human psyche is structured, and as such, what I'm saying should be correct. So that was not the critique at all. The critique against Jung was that even if we have archetypes, not a problem. But how do you explain the manifestation in a culture, in other cultures? In other words, we have the manifestation, we have the archetype of the king. We have the archetype of the great mother. All these other archetypes which you say, we'll go through one of them in particular, which will be the guide to the next step. But why should this culture manifest this? It's not really a manifestation also, that just to be clear. The archetype is not really manifesting itself. It's manifested through the people. Why should it take on such a form? Why should it take on this cultural form? And as such, he cannot explain, that was our argument last time, why Hasidus would take on this form as we have it now. So even if you're correct, and we have the concept, we have archetypes, and the human psyche is structured that way, that doesn't explain why each culture takes on an individual, unique form in the way they deal with it. Now, Jung had a student, and this student was actually a Yid. It was not a famous Yid, but it was a Yid. His name was Erich Neumann, not Neumann, Neumann, German. We don't want to get into the history of him, it's really not Nagaya, but he went up to he made Aliyah in Tel Aviv, 1930 or that area around. And in 1934, there was a big controversy because Jung he published an essay, I think it was called The State of Psychoanalysis in Our Time, something along those lines. And he printed it, and he said a few things over there which were taken to be anti-Semitic. Now, right now, we're not going to get into if Be'etzem was anti-Semitic, conditioned anti-Semitic. He didn't really meant it or not. That's a historical factor, so really not Nagai to our point. What is Nagai is that his student, Erich Neumann, wrote a letter. So we even have, now we have the letter. It was recently published by Philemon, whatever. They're basically part of the whole Kizvah Jung. They printed the letters from Erich Neumann with Jung. And it's actually fascinating to see the back and forth that Neumann critiqued Jung's understanding of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism in general. We'll get to explain, I'm going to elaborate in a bit. And he said that your understanding, well, your critique of Yahadis was a critique of the Gula seed, the Yid had its years formed in exile. This Freud and Adler, Freud, everyone knows what Freud is. Adler was also at one point a student of Freud. Jung is also a student of Freud. He had a falling out in the early 1900s. It was slowly, and then basically completely. And Jung critiqued Freud many, many times in a lot of his writings. Freud, not so much in his writings, but in the letters we do have. Also, we may eventually sometime get into it because it's Nagai to certain points, but not for today. But what is Nagai is that he, at this point in this essay, he critiqued Freud and he critiqued Adler. Adler was, as I said, he was a student of Freud, and he also went away from Freud because he held that is a will to power. His will to power, although it has some similarities to Nietzsche's will to power, is not the same thing as the will to power of Nietzsche. We're not getting into that now because now, so what did Jung critique? Jung said that his whole point of that essay was to explain, he said it was important to try to understand that psychoanalysis, which is a form of psychoanalysis is a unique form of psychology. Basically, we're trying to understand what goes underneath the psyche, underneath the subconscious, unconscious of the human being, and through there he'll find what neuroses are, whatever it is. So he's trying to explain what neuroses is. That's what Jung is trying to do, and he says that there's a problem over here is that psychoanalysis is not a technique. It's not something, a method, a technique. You can sit down and then we go do a technique, right? Engineering is a technique. You teach him engineering, and he does not put part of his personality into it. It makes a difference. So the engineer is a person that is a outspoken person, makes no difference what his political beliefs are, right? Unless he wants to do suffrage. But other than that, right, it makes no difference. Engineer is the technique. Look, the psychoanalysis is not a technique. It depends on the person's, the analysis himself, the analyst himself, the therapist, the analyst himself gives part of his own self, his own method, the way he is constituted as a human being into the actual therapeutic process. And over there he critiqued Freud and Adler, basically saying that they couldn't understand this concept and they put their personality, their complete misunderstanding of the psyche in general, and thought everybody had that, whatever their neuroses, whatever their complexes were, everybody had that, and they completely did not understand this concept. That's the gist of what he was saying. So Jung, he printed it in the thing. There was obviously a big backlash because basically he said is that, and he went even further. He said all Jews, he writes, all Jews basically doesn't believe that they could have any actual creative process and understanding. It was not exactly flattering to Eden. And again, this was his understanding of a Jew as such. Lamasa, what Neumann wrote back says that your understanding of this Gula seed, a Yid which is formulated by the Gulas, is completely not what a Yid is. And you see them in Freud and Adler, and also the people that you're seeing that are coming to you broken from the problems and from the issues, and that's what you hear, that's what you're dealing with. You don't understand what Yiddishkeit is. And he took under and Jung, he got flack from other people also for Steitzich. And Jung wrote the people that he's having correspondence with Neumann about thing, and that's where he's going to be dealing with. I think it's a very interesting correspondence. Along with a nice thick book. It's about the two of them. But he wrote then The Roots of Jewish Consciousness, I believe, is a 2-volume thing. Was recently published. He never published it. We'll get to a different week why. It's very Nagaya, but right now it's Nagaya. We're trying to give his exposition of Yahadis based on his Jungian. He was a Jungian, based on his Jungian understanding. And you see that he's trying to take care of the problem that we just critiqued Jung. He's trying to take care of that issue. Now, why it takes on this particular cultural form. Now, so his response saying here is he took on the right thing. It took practically 6 years. He never printed it, as I said, and it was ended up 2 volumes. It's just recently published. It's a very interesting book. He published a lot of other stuff afterwards, but this book he never published. Either what is Nagaya is that his understanding of the Gula seed. He's saying that's how you understand Yehadus, understand Judaism, and it's wrong because it's a Gula seed. What is this Gula seed? So now, let's take out the handout. We're going to see that there's on the left of the grayscale on the thing, there's the archetype, Earth, the great mother, the good mother nourishing Earth, the terrible devouring mother, God, law pole, and Hasidic return to Earth. That's on the left side. Now, what it does not mean, what it means, typical images, and why it matters for Neumann. Now, archetype we already spoke about last week. A quick synopsis, that a recap. An archetype is how the world of the person structures everything his psyche. Now, an archetype does not mean that the symbol we give it is what it is. As we're going to take one archetype now, we're going to say precisely what it does not mean. Right? So we're going to take the Earth, the great Earth or great mother as it is. That's actually one of the second book, I believe, that Neumann actually printed. He did a lot of work on consciousness and the Great Mother. These are the two books that he's really known for. He wrote this afterwards. He wrote his whole exposition on Hasidus. Either way, so the Great Mother does not mean a figure. The Earth does not mean sand, dirt, trees, land. That's not what it means. And the Great Mother does not mean a sentimental idea of a great cozy feeling. It's not what the thing. And a terrible devouring mother does not mean an evil demonic earth or earthquake. That's not what it means either. What God or Lopam, in particular God over here, we'll see as we get further along, does not mean Pushit another, like a certain type of Hashem or whatever. Okay, now let's go to the second account, what it means. So what does it mean? An archetype, right, is a deep pattern of psychic experience that can appear through many different images. That is precisely the point. You'll have the typical images, for instance, could be a mother, could be earth, a cave, night, all these things. These are patterns which we associate certain symbolic psychic importance. And you can have one archetype can manifest itself, could portray itself through many different figures and forms. And that's another. A great mother does not mean a literal mother, and does not mean an image of a mother. It's a certain image which could take up, which means what this great mother symbolizes. For instance, let's go to the earth, the great mother, right? So what it means to say is it's a generative matrix of life. This is very important. That means it's the creative process, the creative aspect of every single human psyche. And its vitality, its nature, it's a ground, and mother, it gives you the ground of existence as such. And the typical images that it takes on would be soil, a womb, a cave, a garden, a field. These are all images, which means take up the archetypical image of the Great Mother, right? Now, what does the terrible, this is basically the good one. I'm going to skip the next one. It's basically the same idea. The terrible devouring mother is basically is the abyss. It is this creative process which every human being has at times could be overwhelming. The world is so large as such, and we get lost in without having an anchor in the world. That is what is considered the shadow side of the archetype of the mother, the earth, a great mother. So it can become as an abyss, a swamp, a grave, a dark cave. These are all manifestations which you could have of the image, a symbol of the terrible mother. Now, what does law? And here we're saying God means law. God is equated to law, or it will be the Torah in Neumann's understanding of Yehadus. It is the opposite. It is a counterpart of the creative aspect of the Great Mother. Why? Because what is a creative aspect? Creative aspect is you're opening yourself up to a world of possibility, a world where anything, why is it? The definition of possibility means it's not taking any concrete form. It has no concrete example, right? If it's concrete, it's not a possibility anymore. The definition of potential means it is potential. It is not an actual. It's not actual, right? So the opposite of this creative potential aspect of every human psyche, which has the positive side, we'll call the light side, which is a possibility, and has a negative side. You get lost in the abyss, you get swallowed and lose yourself, your sense of self. The opposite side of that would be rigidness, law, right? Or the Torah in that sense. What we say is it gives you a structured aspect, and that it's structured. There's no potential after. Once it's structured, once you have a concrete thing, there's no more potential. That is what the opposite aspect of the mother archetype would be. Now we have the basic there's potential. In a minute. That is according to Neumann the problem of what happened to Yehadis, Judaism in Gulas. That is the definition of an exile. They became rigid. We'll get in a second. Let's go to how he understands the Beis Hamikdash. How does he understand that the meaning when it was Nevi'ah, it was in the Beis Hamikdash, it was Avodah, what was the point, what was the whole symbolism of this thing? Importantly for Neumann, it makes no difference if the Nevi'im actually transpired and happened as it's portrayed in the Surim. It makes no difference. He said it makes no difference. The point of it here is that it's not an ontological question, what actually existed, or historical question per se in this sense. It's not really historical. It's basically a way the Jews as such, we view ourselves, the way we see ourselves, understand ourselves, or should understand ourselves, put it that way. So when we had the Beis Hamikdash, and there was the Avodah, right? So the Beis Hamikdash, what is it? Is the archetype of the good mother. How? What? The land and its rule. We were connected to what? To a vitality, via by definition. Again, I'm going to give a rather condensed version of it. This is the first volume of the two volumes. It's a long arichas, so we don't have time for it. But the point is, the gist of it is that this is this is a portrayal, this is a projection. I'm going to use manifestation because it's sort of the best word I can think of on the spot, but it does not really mean that the archetype manifests itself to anything else. Either way, the manifestation of the good mother, of the mother earth archetype, was the Yidden in the Zman Dabayis. When we had Nevi'ah, when we were creative, we were connected. That's what we were connected to the divine. We had a direct connection or a possibility to touch the divine. Less so, for instance, there's in the Jungian universe, call whatever you want, there's something called earth religions. What is earth religions? They're primitive religions. There's basically everything before it became westernized, before it became cultured. And one of the many things that have all of them in common is that they go and they're oivid the earth. Why? Because the earth, they understand the vitality which lies in the earth, the cycle of regeneration, the regenerative cycle, right? The earth gives, and then it cycles, right? Which means that by definition is not a fixed, strict, rigid structure. It is something which continuously regenerates and goes over again. The concept of kabunis or bekidim, which is precisely that, being a sacrifice, which is sacrifice in Jungian psychology is the only way to get. What's interesting over here is you do find many of these themes you'll find in Jewish thought. I mean, all thought really. The concept of a sacrifice, of a korban, you go into any not even Hasidic Zayif, you go into even from before that, any that tries to sort of explain the machshove, what is the Kaidos Yitzchak, right? If you were going to bring it on a personal level, it's sacrificing which is important to yourself to get to somewhere else. That is the definition as an archetype of sacrifice. And that's correct. The question over here is, so you're sacrificing, for instance, Bekidim, which is the first part of the land, which is what the regenerative cycle. You're connecting with the concept and understanding of the great divine, which takes up the whole world, and you're giving that as a sacrifice to either get something that will be more like the shadow side, or simply to try to further yourself psychically. However, the problem with this, if you go with the earth religions, is it tended to completely identify with the generative, with the creative aspect of the human psyche. And a mystic, according to Jungian understanding, as opposed to a mystic, one of the issues with a mystic is that they completely lose any sense of self. And they completely get swallowed in the great divinity, which is in the creative process in the whole world. That is one of the drawbacks of the earth religions, as he calls it. And that's precisely where the Torah comes in, the opposite pole, as we said, of the archetype of the earth, of a great mother. It's precisely to ground and not allow the individual psyche or ego consciousness, as to use the Jungian term. Ego, again, he's not a Freudian, so ego for him is not one of the three, ego, the id, and the superego. It does not mean that at all. Ego consciousness means to say is the sense of self, and beyond it, through individuation you get to self with a capital S, that thing. So it's part of the process, and it's part of the process of leading to the self. But it's being aware. That's actually what the Torah is doing. What the Torah is doing is to try to, tains to a certain extent this creative, this understanding, this identification with the divinity in a sense of loss, and allows ego consciousness to form. Which part? How it does it? By introducing some form of rigidity, some form of not. That's what it does, and the problem, what Gulas is, according to Neumann, is that it did it too well. Let's get to the Chorban and understanding it, and I think that will explain, I should answer the question. Now, basically is that this was, as it was a balanced, we had two balanced. We had prophecy, we had connection with the divine, but we also had Torah, which allowed the sense allowed the individual to still be an individual as opposed to simply being part of the klal, part of the whole nation as such, and allowed an individual to exist. Now, what happened over here is we had the Chorban Bayis. What happens after the Chorban Bayis? Well, we lost the Beis HaMikdash, which means we lost the rootedness, the archetypical earth image, a great mother. We lost that, and the only thing we had left was the law. Now, in a healthy, according I guess is Neumann's understanding of the Chorban and of Rabbinic Judaism as such, in a healthy place, we'd have to find a different way of connecting and staying aware and attuned of the divinity as such. However, what happened is, and it was necessary, because if we lost our complete anchor in divinity, in creativeness, in anything as such, that's really what, don't forget, according to Neumann, that was actually the focus of the Beis HaMikdash as more, because then generally, that is, you're trying to connect with the greater consciousness of the world as such. And when we lost that, we would have completely been untethered and completely lost any sense of self, of ego consciousness, of anything at all, of anything as a nation, which is where Rabbinic Judaism steps in. And to halt this thing, we had the Kedim B'Yavne and all these things, which you do find in Chazal, that the Chorban led to, we had to have a different understanding, and this is obvious because until now, the academics call the cult of the temple cult. So it's just a different way of saying is that we had the Beis HaMikdash, our whole focus, our whole focal point was avoiding the Beis HaMikdash, and obviously we had Sanhedrin and everything, there was law, but the whole liturgy and everything was focused around the Beis HaMikdash. We lost that. We definitely had to find something new to focus around. That's clear in Chazal. But according to Neumann, what happened over here is we over-identified with law. Law is rigidity, law is structure, and law is a concretization of the consciousness, of the ego consciousness. By doing that, what happened over here is we became solid individuals, but we completely lost all creativity, and we became rigid structures as such. And that is the Gula seed, as far as Neumann understands it. Which what happens over here is once you over-identify with any single thing, the whole concept of individuation, according to Jung is we take all the shadow. So the shadow is two aspects. Say the shadow. There's the shadow of which we'll call viewed as the kaila, as something with the container which holds everything which is repressed. Everything which is repressed in the human being is held in there. It's not the same repression idea as Freud, just to clarify, but basically that's what. Now, every single word could be repressed. Even positive quality traits could be repressed. I think it's a good example. Let's say, for instance, a people pleaser. Now, the archetype of the self, of being a person that is not a pushover, let's say, not the right word, is the king archetype. King archetype has both sides. You have the golden mean, the golden way, right? That's not virtue ethics. But you have the golden mean, which means you're a self, you're not a pushover, but you also don't overpower other people. You don't overstep on other people to get to you. That will be a great individuated king archetype. A people's pleaser has gone the opposite extreme, and he has completely suppressed the king archetype and became a person that allowed himself to be stepped over. Why? Because he his ego ideal, his image ideal, his imago, his persona, whatever it is, he he thinks that he would make himself more, people will like him more if he does whatever the person wants, whatever the person has asked from him. What happens over here is, and so he went the opposite extreme, he repressed the correct king archetype, and the opposite extreme also. And what happens here is that something gets pushed too much, he'll simply burst into anger and have an explosion, he'll explode. Right? A perfectly individuated person has the boundaries and allows it. So you could even individuate, you could even suppress positive qualities. So it's not the shadow as in the sense of negative. When we say that the shadow, the container, is not necessarily negative as the way we think a shadow is a negative thing. What it means to say is this thing which is unconscious, subconscious, which have been repressed, archetypes which have been repressed. Now, every single archetype has a shadow side to it. Because also you have the great mother and you have the terrible, devouring mother. The terrible, devouring mother is not necessarily terrible. See, these are not normative claims as a good and bad. It means they're two poles, opposite sides of a certain type, and you have to. Be able to incorporate both sides. That's what an individuated person is, and that is what the self is. All right. So now. Shadow. So the law, right? So the opposite side of the shadow side of the law, in this sense, will be a over-identified ego. Ego does not mean gava, not ego. That's ego conscious, a sense of self, and not allow for the creative side of what the human being over here is. Now, the creative side, what it really is, first of all, that is sort of what allows the progression of humanity, as such, according to Freud, according to the Jungian understanding. Not something now. So that is what the Gula seed to Neumann was, and that's what he told Jung that your understanding, or your meeting, whatever, how you see Eden as such was the Gula seed, which is wrong. Zuk Neumann, this idea is underlying the famous story in the famous Gemara and Bumetzia, the Tana Shel Achnui, where Rabbi Eisik was put into a nidhi. And we see in Chazal the story has a very strong resonance, and we have Bunam Nivumis where you see even the ending of the story, and it's alluded to many times. In general, a lot of people like to use this. Everybody has their own thing that I like to take out of it, in terms of the academics, whatever it is. But the way Neumann says that everything I just told you right now, licked in the story from a Tana Rechanui. Now, how do we understand the story? The stories are very important for Jung and the comparative religion as such. Why? Because there are three levels we're going to understand the story. We're going to understand the story in the archetype. We'll say every story. We're going to get a few stories now. We try to bring out the idea of how we understand Hasidus. Right now, we just explained. We didn't even get to Hasidus. We just explained what the Chorban was and the Gula seed, as he calls it. Right. So now we start to get to Hasidus. But a story has the three levels we're going to explain. It has the archetypical name. As we go to each story, to become more concrete, more clear, it has the Jewish cultural form which Neumann believes it took on this archetype. Then it has the understanding, what it means. Right? So now, what's the Tana Shel Achnui? Just a quick recap, a quick synopsis of it. That there was a story about a certain Tana, it was made of parts, if it could be Kabul Tim or not. So Rabbi Shmelke Harkin says it's to it, and Chazal says that it's to it, and Chazal, the Chum in general, held that it is Tumit. Rabbi Shmelke is back and forth, and Lamaas Rabbi Shmelke was not able to change anybody's opinion. So he said, if I can't change you from the legal aspect, I'm going to go, this tree should be mine. The tree uprooted itself, and 40 amma, whatever it was, 400, and whatever it was. He said, it didn't change anything. So the Amish Mayim, I think Amish Mayim Yechiach, that this small Amish Mayim, this 6x6 teifach, whatever it is, will move, and flew upstream. The wall should fall. As I said, the wall should be mechiach. The wall almost fell. It didn't fall completely because not to kill anybody, whatever, because it chumim, and it didn't go back up because it shall be a stay thing. It was like Adu Yom Hazeh. Either himself, as he said, Min Shemayim, will show. And the Basco came out and said that what? That the look is like Rabbi Eisik, and the Bashir said that Amishich and Basco, and Halacha is to it. He was still not choize. It's tummy. He was still not choize. The matama, every single thing there's a time. Whatever it is, what happened after the guy to what Neumann is trying to bring up for the story. Zuk Neumann. This story is precisely this thing. What was the argument over here? We had an argument between can the divine realm, can divinity intercede into the legal law pole concept of Torah. Rabbi Eisik said yes, Chachumim, and that's what the halacha stayed? Absolutely not. Here we see a clear cut from what? From divinity, meaning from the concept divinity has any say in our matters today's days, to, as the Neumann is reading, to the Torah law as such, and that is what started it all. But this happened right after the Churban. I mean, all these things are in Shia, these are the generation of the Churban, and that is the decisive watershed moment in our history of Judaism as such, which led to what we have now. Now, so just to recap over here. So Neumann believes it was important. We had to have something which would not allow us to sort of float off into the abyss. We could have once about Chad and Bais, you don't have any concrete thing. However, ultimately, it became too strong, too egocentric, too ego consciousness, too much of a self, and that is what led to what we have now. So, Erich Neumann, what is the solution to this? That was Hasidus. That's he's telling Freud. I'm telling Jung that that your understanding is a gulasi. But look at 150 years ago. He was writing in the early 1900s. We have the inception of Hasidus and also Zionism, which for him also had similar, different, but the same idea. What time is it?
Ironically, the Zionists use the word Golet.
We're going to have a lot to speak about that later, because there's few aspects. The Zionists may have been the ideology behind the Zionists was the arguments in the actual Zionists themselves, and the younger generations, interestingly, not from Herzl, completely separated the ideology behind it, and it's Nagaya, we later Nagaya, exactly what they held that it does, because it was a response. Every single movement is a response to something. The movement happens because they have to respond to something. What is the response? It changes what the movement is. And that changes also to understand what the problematic, what they're dealing with over here is. I'm going to throw in a small thing of Spinoza. I want to say contrast to Spinoza. I'm not going to get too much into it, but it will be the guy in the future, which only I'm even mentioning now at all, even we're sort of running out of time. Spinoza, I think I find personally an interesting parallel with his understanding, or Spinoza's understanding of the law and Neumann's understanding of the law. What is it? Spinoza basically said that we have two aspects. We have the culture, we have theology, and we have the politics. Just say, we have politics and we have theology. For Spinoza and for Neumann at this point, you'll see the two separate aspects. The law, according to Spinoza, is theology. For Spinoza, it's philosophy, and for Neumann, it is psychology. Okay. So the question is, where does the law play a role in this aspect? The law as an external law, and for Spinoza, it is simply a constitution of a people at a certain time, a certain place. The Hebrews, as he calls them, in it's a cyril in whatever it was, and that's the minute they left, it was not Negaya. Why? Because it's a constitution. It's a state. When the state doesn't exist, the Torah is not Negaya. And because we still believe it does, that means we're encroaching our law. We change it from political aspect into a theological aspect, which we're encroaching onto the truth of philosophy onto Torah. From Torah on, that is encroachment, according to Spinoza. For Neumann, the encroachment of law is not so much a blanket encroachment. Everything is with the gvil. Because the encroachment from the law is an encroachment onto theology, onto psychology, or rather, that's not much like psychology. It is the living religion. That is what the law is encroaching on. The living aspect, it encroaches onto that. For Spinoza, it is encroaching onto philosophy. It's being the guy in the future, so I want to bring it over here. It's Sam aside. Either way, Zuk Neumann. This is where Hasidus comes in. What's Hasidus come in? Hasidus is not simply a return to the state that we were in the Beis Hamikdash, or like a simple crude earth religion, as the Maskim like to, it was a crude, simple. No, of course that's not we didn't go back to earth religion. I'm going to see divinity and everything, and everything Hashem is in alles, and we could go and find Hashem everywhere now, and we could abolish the law. No. It's a lot more nuanced than this. Basically, we are left with the law. Chassidus, Vashentev understood that we have this issue now of Neumann's understanding of the rigidity of the self, of law, and using these same symbolic, same culture in which we're going to revitalize and reconnect to the earth mother, good mother archetype, and become back revitalized, which explains the cultural aspect, because we're going to where we are now, which, if you trace all history, was basically is two forms of living. Right? We had the by some English with the law, and one became overpowered the other, and it just evolved on its own into this what he would call a certain monstrosity of rigidity of rabbinic Judaism, and using the same terms, on its own terms, they're going to revitalize it. So we're not going back to how it was, but we're doing the same concept, same idea, which by some English is supposed to do. How does it do it? We're going to go to 3 stories, which I think will explain the concept. We'll try to make it quick. The 3 stories, because Hasidus, we get to maybe next week why stories are important from either way. So again, we're going to take the archetypical pattern, the archetype of the story, the unique cultural sense of the story, and what Hasidus, what it means for an individual according to Hasidus. Now, the first story is of Erich Neumann, which is a very famous story with the guy in the video, different versions of it, but I'll give you the version which he gives it. Erich Neumann, that basically is, somebody once watched him, somebody called Erich Neumann, he's running around, he's digging in some random place. Why are you digging here? He said, I had a dream. It was my dream. My dream was that there's a treasure chest buried underneath in this spot. So he laughed and said, I had a dream that said somebody, Erich Neumann, underneath the stove has a treasure chest. He said, you don't see me running over there. So he ran to the thing, he dug, and he found the treasure. Right? It's a story. It's a famous story. What is the archetype? And Jungian on the Jungian thing, archetype of this type of story is called the quest, a treasure quest. It basically it has really 5 stages, but the gist of it basically is that you have it's a change of the moral is a change of perspective. In other words, you thought one thing was like this, somebody told you something, and you went on a quest to try to find whatever you're looking at, and somebody told you something which made you realize that your whole perspective of something was wrong, and then you went back to the original place and you found it in there. So everything, what was the means that everything be'etzem was in you, was there the whole time. You just were looking at it wrong, right? So this is the archetype. We have many stories that are written in this archetype, in this understanding, and in the secular world, meaning in general, we have many whatever it is, and there's fairy tales and all these things with this archetype. And in the unique Hasidic understanding of this is that the person itself, okay, tzimtzum. How does Neumann understand the tzimtzum? Right? Everybody likes to think of tzimtzum because it's whatever the reason is. So now, we're not going to get too much into it, we're running out of time, but the idea of tzimtzum is, according to Neumann, that tzimtzum is basically you had divinity all over the place, right? There was Pushit, it took over the whole world, and through contraction, through tzimtzum, it allowed the self to emerge. It was importantly, it's not that you had tzimtzum and then the self emerged. The actual emergence of the self only happened, the world. I went too far. The emergence of the world was through tzimtzum. It was at the point of tzimtzum, the emergence of the world came out. And this concept, in truth, it's dugish in a lot of chassidus that it's the gevira itself is chesed, right? The gevira, the tzimtzum itself is his pashas of chesed. It's the same. He's actually like a nice few pages. Hammers in this point. But the point here is a correct point. However, how does he view it? It's the sense that the ego consciousness, the self, could only come when you withdraw. Remember, we spoke of the earth archetype, that the earth religions, if you over-identify with the earth, you lose any sense of mystic. So the point is that you only through a withdrawal do you have the self that comes out. That is what tzimtzum is. That is his understanding, his interpretation of tzimtzum. Now,
you disagree?
The concept is correct. The question is more what he takes from it onto Chassidus, right? The individual path, right? So, what is Nagai is that the individual, the definition of individual is a single, is a person, right? So the individual himself is unique for this individual. In other words, you have the story, you have the cultural, the concept of the story of Yitzchak Mekroke. It means that tzimtzum concept idea of a change, that the self only comes out through a complete change of perspective, and everybody finds himself particularly. It's an individual. It is, you find that whatever you're looking for is not in Nishtan Yena, is not in the other, it is in yourself. It's tzaddik, for instance, and the tzaddik is not here we're going to speak more about tzaddik next week, but the point of it here is that when the guy that the tzaddik is not here to give you your tikkun, I mean to say that do the tikkun for you. The tzaddik is here to give you your unique tikkun, your unique way. We'll see the other two stories to bring everything all together. Bring everything together, we'll understand everything. The thing. So, what does the story teach? The story over here teaches is that we're not reverting back to the initial understanding. Yitzchak Kook did not go and revert back to his initial understanding. He just that there's a treasure which that the treasure lies over there. That what the treasure is. In other words, he got a new piece of information and he realized his whole perspective that the treasure does not lie by the other person; it lies within himself. That is what he took. That is the understanding of this story. And in Hasidism, he says that each individual has his own path, his own malach, his own derech, and that is what we are supposed to understand. The second story is Rabbi Shmelke and sleep. Also different gesuris in the story. I'm going to say the story, the gesa which he brings down. But that's the normal Meilich, and it was not the Bashanta, whatever it is. Either way, the Shmelke is really right. He has his money's right. Okay, let's see exactly. He says let's bring any more information. The point over here is that Shmelke that he did not sleep in the bed at all. He would even put a candle between his hands to make sure that if he falls asleep, it'll burn him. The wax will drip down, whatever, to wake him up. The Meilich Majensa, the Meilich saw him once and realized that either was speaking learning, could understand, or whatever. He realized that it's Loizu Aderech, that's not the way. And he told him that he should lie down and he'll wake him up or whatever it is. Either way, he didn't wake him up, he woke up until the morning. And he was refreshed and he was not upset at all. This is the story. Which archetype is it? The archetype of rebirth. What does that mean, archetype of rebirth? That again, this is understanding in the Jewish cultural sense. That's the archetype in the general sense. In the Jewish cultural, in the understanding is ayin, yeshma ayin, the concept of, let's say, Shabbos, for instance, at the point of rebirth. You have to go, in order, again, this concept, you find a lot. You do find a concept on, you'll see when we get to the period, it's actually, like at least 3-4 times he brings down this concept. They're based on the Ravid and the Tzayvitzira, whatever it is. Either way, what is this archetype of rebirth? What is Shabbos, for instance? You have the whole week that you think, and Shabbos you change, you go back into a state of rest, a state of being a state of internalization, and from there you get the chiyas again to go out again into the world. Right? That is the concept. That is the concept of rebirth, or in the Kabbalistic language, as they want to use, will be yesh ba'ayin. You go into the ayin, you're bittul. You mevatel yourself into the ayin, and through that you come back down and you get a whole new chiyas, a whole new perspective, a whole new whatever it is, right? So again, we see here we have the concept that what Hasidus, according to Neumann, is teaching, that through this story, the concept of rebirth, and a particular type of rebirth is going back to Shabbos, right, or particularly to Shabbos, Yom Tov, or these types of cultural things which are meant to stop you for a minute, go back into, so withdraw into the ayin, into the, and come back again, rebirth, refreshed. That is a cultural manifestation. And Chassidus, it will mean particularly that the way, well, we're going to get to Tish, we'll explain a little more. Either way. Now, the individual, so we had the first story. The first story taught us the concept of each path individual. The second story in the story, the concept of rebirth, of withdrawing into yourself, into the vital, precisely the part which, according to Rabbinic Judaism, left out. The concept of withdrawing within yourself to your sense of creativity, your sense of the earth archetype, the good mother archetype. And from there, we've revitalized yourself into... It is, but right, but that's precisely where the first story comes in, a complete perspective of what it's supposed to be doing. As opposed to simply saying, I'm doing Shabbos, I'm doing Yom Tov, that is what we're doing. The whole change, the meaning behind it, changed into a different thing.
The nuance.
Right. So that's precisely the point. We're taking the laws as we have it. We're not changing the laws, the Rabbinic Judaism, but we're giving a whole new perspective, a meaning of it, and a psychological understanding of the self, or how the self becomes individuated, how we're supposed to go about it, which is why he can still use it, which why Hasidus, according to him, explains, and that's what Jung didn't explain, it explains why it took these cultural forms, because it's using Rabbinic Judaism, it's using the laws, using the Torah as we have it, but it can complete different type of meaning, to a new internal psyche, a new change of perspective. And that is that. Yeah, as opposed to the way it was used in through the law, the rigidity of the law. Right, I mean, right. So now, the third story, And this, this I think will tie in everything. Will tie in everything together. And the story is that Bunam. Bunam was once at an inn, and he was at an inn, and he wanted to daven. And the Master says it was a busy day, and basically we went back and forth. He couldn't daven there. So instead of Chassidim wanted him to move, and he said no, he's going to stay here because perhaps his tafkid is right now with this inn. What he has to do right now is at this inn. This is, even though it's hard, this is what he has to believes maybe is pointed right now. Now, what is this archetype of the story? The archetype in Jungian terms is the prince in exile, or the divine spark, or that's actually the alchemy according to Jung, where he has the whole thing in alchemy. Let's say literally one whole volume is whatever. He was very into alchemy. What meaning not alchemy as in actually trying to get silver or iron or whatever it is into gold, but the concept of why it was such a fascination for humanity. Sometimes what do you think? Everybody wants to get there. Can you make a regular metal into gold? Then you have all your problems to solve. No. He has a whole different psychological understanding of what it is, and it's a very, very deep thing. It's this concept that in the mundane there is a spark, and this, I'm using the word spark, which is precisely what he's referring. This is the concept of netzoitzes, according to after tzimtzum, whatever it means. In the world will spread that there's divinity in every mundane object. That is what's called, right, the netzoitzes or spark, as he's using it. So precisely that is the divine child in exile. The divine, every single thing in exile in the world has a divine divinity, a spark, which is. What is the divinity? What is the spark? The creation, the creative aspect, the life, vitality, not form and rigidness and ossification, according to Neumann's understanding of Rabbinic Judaism. Right? So it's precisely, so that was that's the archetype. And according to Bunam's, according to the Hasidic on the cultural aspect of it, it is netzoitzes, it sparks. What Bunam is saying is that we're going to be lifting up the sparks, to use the terms that thing, or we're going to understand that in this thing which is preventing us from actually doing what we want to do lies divinity. Now, the important part of it here is that does not mean, for Neumann, does not actually mean the way, it doesn't necessarily mean that it actually means the way everybody understands it. It's literally, we imagine a spark in the vessel, but the point is even more than that. It does not even mean there's actual divinity, the way we understand divinity to be. It's not like the chaylik or the kiss or whatever it is. What does it mean? So netzoitzes means, let's use a shadow, what we spoke about before. The shadow understanding, which will be, which causes individuation. In other words, it's precisely in neuroses for Jung, for Neumann, for any of the Jungian aspect, is something which was repressed, something which you have not managed to be individual, or at times, even if you are in a great good path, but you're becoming too focused, too ossified, too rigid in one particular thing, the other aspect of this thing would start pushing back at you, and that can lead to neuroses. We're not going to explain, there's a big enough community, obviously, in psychoanalysis, how you actually heal a person, but it's not negayed to us, right? So the point here is that the spark, which is divinity, which is over here, the things that you have to be aware of, which you have to, when you say mountains, you have to individuate in yourself, comes up as a pushback onto the way you are, onto what you want, think what you want to do, or how you are. He's giving something which is not comfortable for you to do. It's precisely these pushbacks, which are called netzoitzes, or the sparks, which is what you have to recognize as such, that it's a call for you to individuate yourself, and that is what makes the person into a self with a capital S. So the Bunam, according to the culture, the Hasidic understanding, Bunam understood that precisely in this part where my derech, my understanding, what I wanted to do, there's something telling me right over here that is my particular form I have to be mala, I have to individuate on a particular aspect. That is what the story as such took out, according to thing, right? So now, if we take, so we'll skip the thing. Now, let's go back to what we were speaking about last week. The master, the Tish, Shraim, all these things, right? Now, we said that according to Jung, we can maybe understand that we could call the Tish a sacred meal. We could call the Rebbe the great sage or whatever, right? All these names, but it doesn't explain why the concept of a tish is unique to Hasidus, unique to Yahadus, unique to Judaism, right? Why particularly this form? Like, you have people sitting around, they have a Rebbe on table, particularly dafka with food. Well, that's a sacred meal, but not explaining why the wise old man has to be with the tish. Why singing? Why the Torah, Nish Torah? Why all these cultural aspects just make the tish unique? Jung doesn't explain. All he does is simply explain. He gives you the names of the archetypes. So this is where Neumann comes in. Is like, I'll explain to you why. Because what? Phenomenology is how the question isn't how we experience it, but the question is why do we need it this way? Phenomenology is experience. I mean, in the broad sense, phenomenology is the whole. Either way, so Neumann is saying azoi, because precisely what these things mean in our culture, in Jewish culture, in Judaism, in Yahadus is different than it means, which is why the archetype manifested itself in this way. Shabbos, why the Tish and Shabbos? What does Shabbos mean? Shabbos is for in our culture, has to do going back to the Yashmain, rebirth, regeneration. And what the food has to that mean, what the singing, all these things are unique to our culture, and they're a take on the archetypical concept. But more importantly, each person, going back to the story, the initial story of going back to the second story, right? Each person takes on, meaning from actually not going to the Bunam, that's the concept of each individual, right? Each person that has an angel. Each person takes out a different concept of it. However, what is Nagai is that the Tish as such, because food means to us certain things, because singing means to us certain things, because of how our history, that is what Hasidus took all this stuff, and we're going to go and give new meaning to it. We took the rigidity of the law, we took the rigidity of the Torah as Rabbinic Judaism, as he calls it, which is simply thing, and we gave each thing, each law, its new meaning, and that's why it got manifested, the archetype, in these particular accounts. So he takes care of the critique, which we had officially initially with Jung, right? The Bunam teaches, right? So Rabbi Eisik teaches, you change your perspective and realize that everything depends on yourself. And that's the role then of a tzaddik is a particular role, according to Neumann, particularly because of how he understands what the tzaddik is supposed to be doing to teach the individual, right? Rabbi Shmelke teaches that the ego consciousness, in order to be rebirthed, renewed, to become an individual, has to go back to the ayin. That's where certain cultural practices for doing those things. So Bunam teaches that the world itself speaks to you in a certain way, according to your understanding, and they teach individual themselves. Now, obviously, to go through each practice is, we don't have the time for it, also we're not going to gain too much from it, but that concept, all we're trying to bring it over here is that to understand that Neumann is telling you that we can understand Hasidus, and then by extension, we can understand Yahadus in a completely different way, with using the Jungian understanding of what everything means. The way you understand until now was the law, and that's what Jung critiqued, and he was right, according to Neumann, to critique it this way. There's no chiyas, there's no anything. And we completely changed the concept. Hasidus understood this and revitalized and changed it, and now we can have a whole different understanding of what all our aspects means. Right? And that's why also, for instance, Zionism, for instance, was very important for Neumann. Why? Because what is Zionism? Zionism is going back a different route into the land, back to Hebrew, all these things, right? So what they've all done is a different way of going back to the initial thing that we lost to the Churban Bayis, going back to the initial concept, the initial earth archetype, initial revitalization, the chiyas in each of these things. The problem over here is, the question over here is, what exactly is this religion according to Neumann? Are we just relegated religion simply to psychology? Well, that would be right. But so in other words, he took care of the critique we had against Jung, explained why each in the religion has its own cultural way of dealing with the archetypes. He explained the Yahadis, and so we understood one religion. We could go to each each understanding. But Lamasa, he took care of the issue critique that we had, that Jung explained the archetypes. And of course, because he explained archetypes, because he say that we find this concept of comparative religion, we find this concept of a sacred meal in multiple places, we find the concept of the wise old man in all religions, and all these other things does not disprove Jung. If anything, the argument can be made that it proves him right, because Lamasa, I discovered, I've discovered a truth, a trans-historical truth, a transpersonal, this is all humanity. Humanity as such has these truths in them. That actually should be proving his point. The problem over here is
Based on Judeo religion?
No, Jung actually was very, very interested in the Oriental religions.
An archetype of
Everything. And the point of view, not only that, for instance, his whole thing with the mystic, with the Buddhism and all these things, he said that the biggest problem they have with that is that their whole tafkid is precisely become a mysticism. And he thinks mysticism difference between a religious mystic or what Neumann would say, the whole concept of rebirth, right? For also, concept here is not to be available to come back down, to go precisely the void is here on earth. Right, so that the whole point of the Buddhists, of the mystics, of the Buddhism is completely to bittle of the self at all. To the point is to completely identify with the collective unconscious. Right. And that was Jung's critique in general. It's especially for the Westerns. Ever since we had the Judeo-Christian understanding of the psyche as such. But that was actually key. But he's actually he spent from 1915 to 1920 studying. Interestingly, one of the letters Neumann writes to Jung, what's interesting is you know more about the Indian religion who are in the other end of the world than you know about Judaism, which is, your party, is a German part of the whole thing. That was actually one of the letters he writes. The first.
Is that the reason why we have people who are seeking, they usually don't know their own?
Yeah, that's the thing. We go to try to find. They go to they go to the Buddhism and those things.
But of course, obviously, he looked at it from a psychological lens. But we can use it as putting a kiss back into Allah.
That's the idea.
That is a question that we're leaving off right now. Is it taka correct? Can we actually do it? I mean, there's no question. It sounds like a very nice system. Explains it has a lot of beauty to it. The question is that really how Hasidus understands itself? Right now, what we're trying to understand is how does Hasid, at the best of our ability, how does Hasidus understand itself? Right? We're not trying to understand how the Baal Shem Tov experienced the life. It's impossible. We can't understand that somebody else actually understood. We can't put ourselves in anybody's mind. And there's no question. I can never understand how the Baal Shem Tov, any tzaddik per se, right? The question is, how do they understand Hasidus as such? How, right? The same way I can understand the phenomenological experience of a Christian, but I can understand I could try to understand how he views himself, how he understands himself. We're trying to uncover ultimately, is this Hasidus what Hasidus is, or is this how Neumann decided, I'm going to take Hasidus concept and I'm going to make a whole new religion out of it. Well, I wouldn't call it religion per se. But that is a question that we're staying with now, which we have to going forward, we have to understand, because Avshas have big ramifications, because the system is very nice. And as you go through, read all the work, all the things, it's a lot nicer than the way I was just meant to put it down now in an hour. It's a lot more depth and a lot more thing to it. I try to give it justice. I try to not to make any straw man, because when we are going to attack it, we have to attack the actual person, not just not a straw man, which we have to be a steel man, something that's best of our ability. But ultimately, the question then will be is, assuming that he's wrong, then first of all, what do we do with all these things? Because a lot of things seems to be true, right? And it's really a question in general. If a system is wrong, how can we take things out of it? And the problem over here is, the only way we can take things out of a system is wrong is we have to know why the system is wrong. If I don't know why the system is wrong, and I just know it's wrong for whatever reason, but I like certain aspects from it, for these aspects do not work if the whole system is wrong. So he gave a very nice pashat, a whole nice ishtalshalis, a whole nice of a historicist, I guess, a reading of the way where we are now, of Yahadis in general. The question over here is it correct?
In a historical sense, it is correct. Obviously, the Shab, before the Chavis brings everything was very, very focused on those things. Our religion that we have today is a rabbinical religion. There's almost come out no day after day, right? So it's a very, very. before Hasidus, it became very, very dry and very, very formulaic, as they say, and then eventually.
Yeah, but
Hasidus
I
can
can
give
give
them
some pushback that almost every single archetype that you touched on, we share. Let's say, for instance, tefillah. They had tefillah in the mikdash. We expanded it after the
not
mikdash.
necessarily. Tefillah was a tefillah that was first of all,
Yeah.
a couple of times I've said there was no tefillah. I mean, you say the tefillah was
Right.
the tefillah of Klal Yisrael in the Zman itself.
Right,
And not
some
and
form.
even according to the Rambam that there was tefillah, it's just whatever I needed at that moment. There wasn't that type of tefillah we have today.
I mean, yes and no. But in the Gemara, it's clear that Anshe Gedoyle is the one that was Miyasa the Yitches Bruches.
Yeah, of course.
Right. But the Anshe Gedoyle was already the Zman Abayis. But Shmila Kuten, when the Shmila Kuten by the thinking that was already after he had Shemona Esrei. So again, also that's something Chok Seshonim. The Ram Taka holds the Ramban on the spot argues in the Rambam. But again, you're correct. You're right, but you don't have to go. Let's go back to the first bias. The first bias definitely didn't have it. Right. So we don't have to. Meaning, so these are all asides. We don't get nitty. The point is, yes, your thing is correct. The question is, what does it mean? In other words, the issue is always how we interpret it. I can give you the facts. The facts are 100% the way you said it. We had the Beis Hamikdash, and no question about the Beis Hamikdash was everything was centered around the avodah, everything. The whole day was around the whole year, right? The whole Shul Shigulim, the whole concept was around, right? And it's precisely, and the Shul Shigulim was dafka to go up to Beis Hamikdash. There's no question about it. It was centered around it. The question over here is, what does that mean? What is that meaning? Neumann's understanding of the meaning over here is precisely a concept of ego. Self of individuation, a fine balance between the earth archetype, going back to the collective unconscious, which is, by the way, that's where I should never said it, but that's really the whole vitality, the whole formulation, whatever it comes from the collective unconscious, is going back to it, and the law not allowing it to be swallowed whole by it. That is his interpretation from it. So you're correct with the facts. The question is his interpretation correct? And the problem with that, and the question over is in general, then, if the interpretation is wrong, can we still then even use anything? Because we saw, we're towing a fine line. That is.
Right. Very good. Right. But regarding the archetypes, does everybody have all of the archetypes and their repressed parts of it, or is it the archetype is collective unconscious? It's collective unconscious.
So Be'etzem is a shikol machloikis in the Jungian today's thing. Again, I actually sort of mentioned it last week. I mentioned in the passing. So you have the same issue with Plato and the ideas and form. Is there a form of garbage? Can it be a perfect garbage? I mean, this is a question that was, and Plato himself had a big. I was grappling with it, and depending which one of his, one of his dialogues are considered later or not. The question is, some people want to say he was chayzer from the whole concept in the Parmenides. I mean, it's not accepted in today's days. That's more middle and whatever it is. But I'm saying the concept it is a question. Does every single concept, does marriage have an archetype? Does it not? Does every event, every life event in a person have an archetype? Or it simply is the same, for instance, bar mitzvah. The archetype of bar mitzvah for Jung is coming of age concept, right? So now, and that's what we find, especially in the Indian, I mean, today's is not so much, but I mean, the sequester, what's it called? When they're 16, whatever it is, they become the 16, the Spanish to make a whole party, for instance, right? That's their coming of age. You have the Indians, everything, right? What is a concept over here? The concept over here is that it's supposed to be a psychological concept of a boundary. Till now, I was a child. Now I'm an adult and taking the responsibility. It's a loud thing, and now every single all cultures have different ways of celebrating it. There's certain, African tribes still today's days. There's certain they have to go through initiation. And the initiation, right? Some of them are absolutely horrible for our Western understanding, right? So what exactly is the archetype? Every single aspect is the archetype. In other words, is the archetype in the archetype? All these things again, they're not 100% clear, and the question over here is exactly how we define it, but there's no question that there are certain forms which our experiences definitely take.
Is there a relationship between archetype and tzira or
tzira as a chomer and tzira? How, in other words, a chomer is what? Is the unformed human being, and the tzira. but you can't have a tzira without a chomer, right?
Forms, whatever.
No, so I mean, yeah, it's just off the top of my mind. I didn't really think it through, so I'm sort of hesitant to give what I think. But again, the chomer, yes, is an unformed aspect. The tzira is what gives it as form. But the archetype is not so much. It's the manifestation of the archetype, but it's not. I guess it's a loose analogy. I'll have to think about it more to give what I personally think. I don't never put in those language. I mean, again, it's definitely not really what the Greeks meant by the chomer and tzira. Although, I mean, Aristotle does. No, the question is more: can we use chomer? Can we use cause? Let's say, can we use cause and effect? Right, the four causes and the six and the Neoplatonics. Can we use it universally, not only physical causation? Right. So Schopenhauer, in the fourfold root of sufficient reason, fourfold root of the law of sufficient reason, whatever, that was his dissertation. That's precisely saying that's that's the mistake everybody made until now, and that's. Bekitzer, the point of his question is: can you really use such a thing, which is really more intended in the physical sense, to think? Is there a form? There is form and matter, and then in let's say in the midas, right, in ethics, right? But is that it's not the same potential, and that the physical, when we're physical, each four causes, are they really the same causes? Is a logical cause the same as a physical cause? We use it the same, but is it really the same thing? All I'm trying to say here is you have to know really if it's exact same thing or it's a loose analogy. It seems like that's good. It's analogous. I don't know if it's exactly the same concept.
Interchangeable.
Like everything else.